Hi everyone, I just wanted to do a quick little unscripted off-the-cuff video talking about what's been happening over the past couple of days with the US election. So if somehow you're not aware, and I did literally have to tell somebody the other day, Americans went to the polls and chose to re-elect convicted felon Donald Trump to be president. And obviously that has pretty significant repercussions for global climate action. In his previous presidency, Trump pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, the United Nations Climate Accord, and on the campaign trail this time, he said that he wants to do the same, and he's espoused a drill, baby, drill philosophy, promoting the extraction of fossil fuels, and has labelled clean energy and climate change in general as a scam, and has surrounded himself with people who are of similar opinion, notably Elon Musk. And so, yes, I don't think there's any sugarcoating this. This is pretty devastating news for climate action. Specifically, however, it's devastating for American climate action. And this is, by the way, not ignoring or seeking to downplay the impacts elsewhere in terms of reproductive health, in terms of the suffering in Ukraine and Gaza, and I don't know, in America. I'm not going to touch on that stuff. I'm just going to talk about the climate specifically. So when I first got the news, it was very difficult to see any kind of positive in it. And I'm not really going to say in this video that there is a positive to be found. You could argue maybe the positive is that it's possible that his economic policy is going to run America into the ground, Argentina style, and maybe we get to hard reset the American economy. But I don't personally want that to happen because that's going to cause a lot of suffering. I think what I'm going to try and do in this video is just set out why I think it's not necessarily a doomsday scenario globally. I think nationally, there are also some rays of hope. Let's talk about the national stuff first. So President Biden passed the single largest piece of climate legislation in history, the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, and a lot of the money that has been tied up with that has been spent. The clever thing about the IRA was that it was distributed between lots of different initiatives. It wasn't just one big thing that you could repeal. So a lot of the money that has been spent is going to continue to be spent, and the majority of it has been spent in Republican districts, or districts that voted Republican. And so you could argue that actually there is going to be quite a strong pushback on removing that funding if people know that is where the funding comes from. We're going to be reliant on the media landscape, and that's not exactly worked out great so far. But the funding that has yet to be allocated remains to be seen exactly how much of that the Republican Party, as it now is, can mess with. So there are reasons, I think, that, some of that, there are reasons to believe that some of the climate initiatives and clean energy initiatives specifically that have been enacted to date at a federal level are going to continue. Obviously, there are going to be continuing efforts in states like California, in Texas, bizarrely, in terms of solar, to continue the rollout of renewable energy and generally to continue to decarbonize. And the reason that is going to happen is the same reason why this is not really the doomsday scenario for global action either, because it has been for a little while now economically advantageous to decarbonize at least electricity supply. Other sectors like transport, steel, agriculture, not so much. But in terms of electricity, the economics now just makes sense to use low carbon sources. And that's why a Trump presidency isn't going to completely switch off the low carbon electricity, at least, movement globally, because it just makes sense for people to continue to build out solar and wind and other sources like hydro and geothermal. It's why we are seeing exponential growth of these technologies and connected technologies like batteries. That's not going to change. This movement, this set of technologies is like a juggernaut at this point, and Trump is not going to derail them being rolled out. So it's not as if the entire world is going to come to a standstill. American projects specifically, especially ones that rely on federal funding, that's a different story, and at this point all bets are off in terms of what that's actually going to look like. But globally, this isn't going to completely derail things. Yes, there is going to be the problem of what looks like quite a likely trade war and America isolating itself. And that's going to make American industries in, for example, solar manufacturing way less competitive than, say, Chinese competitors. But the market becoming unavailable or less available for imports means that there is going to be a downturn in those same industries in other countries like China, but also Europe. I'm not blind to that being a significant negative associated with this result, but the economics still hold out. And I think that's maybe the key message I want you to come away from this video with, is that just because a significant economy, we can't get around the fact that the US is a large part of the world economy. Just because that is doing its own thing, it isn't going to totally change how the rest of the world fundamentally is changing. The other thing, in terms of emissions, that I wanted to talk about is this analysis from Carbon Brief. I'll leave a link in the description to it. Has been doing the rounds, saying that the Trump presidency could add, I think it was 4 billion tons a year of emissions to American emissions by 2030. It is important to note that that was relative to Biden administration, not to the Harris administration, and I believe it also doesn't account for the possible expansion of fossil fuel extraction that's proposed by President Trump. Whether or not that extraction actually makes economic sense remains to be seen, but that is a scary figure. I believe in the article it's equivalent to raising the emissions saved by rolling out all renewables worldwide over the past 5 years at the start of the year, because this year's been a bumpy year in terms of renewable rollout. It's bad. There's no way to sugarcoat that particular piece of news. It is bad. Do remember, however, that America currently represents approximately 1/8 of global emissions. It's somewhere between 10 and 15% of global emissions. That part of the global economy is now presumably going to do its own thing, either stay where it is in terms of carbon intensity, maybe continue to slightly decrease because, as I said, the economics just make sense. But the rest of the world is continuing to decarbonize. The US hasn't actually reduced its emissions by all of that much since 1990, whereas the EU has reduced them by, I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but it's somewhere in the region of about 30%. The UK has reduced it by about 40. I think it might have been 44%. The rest of the world is going to continue on that trajectory, and the rest of the world is the majority of global emissions. So it's not, I think, the doomsday scenario that some people are painting this as, that because the US has decided that it's not going to decarbonize at a federal level anymore, that somehow that means the world will. That's not how things work. Okay, so we're talking about 15% of global emissions potentially having an increase. So something added to them. How much remains to be seen. I think the takeaway from that, and maybe the other big takeaway from this whole video, is that this, in practical terms, in my opinion, and also I talked to a lot of other sort of green policy people, we're in a big WhatsApp group together, the takeaway seems to be that if 1.5, meaning limiting warming to less than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial, was ever still in play before this election, and a lot of people would say it wasn't, then it definitely isn't now. I think this is the moment where you can say 1.5 has just sailed. Coincidentally, reading a report this morning that this year we may well see the annual temperature anomaly being over 1.5 for the first time. Doesn't mean we've reached the threshold. It has to be a 20-year average for that to happen. But whilst 1.5 may be gone, and maybe was gone already, 2 degrees is very much still in play. And 2 degrees, limiting warming to 2 degrees or less, is absolutely still achievable. Because, as I said before, the rest of the world is going to continue doing its own thing. Modified by America. When America catches a cold, the rest of the world... When America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Sure. But the rest of the world is going to continue to decarbonize, and emissions are going to likely peak this year, maybe next year, and they will fall after that. And it's now a question of how quickly they're going to fall, largely due to leadership in places like China and Europe. India is the one that everybody seems to forget talking about. That's kind of going to be the kingmaker this century. But absolutely still possible in theory, to limit them to less than 2 degrees. At the moment, global climate policy that everybody sort of signed up to limits it to 2.7 degrees by 2100, which is definitely too high. But also, you have to remember that that's come down from approximately 4 degrees that we expected pre-Paris Agreement. And yes, some people are worried that the US pulling out of Paris again may just kill Paris dead. I personally don't think that's going to happen. I also don't personally see the US pulling out of the UNFCCC. Again, predictions are hard, especially about the future. But 2.7 degrees is currently where we're at, and almost certainly in Azerbaijan, in Baku, and also in Brazil, we're going to see that number come down in terms of NDCs, in terms of the emissions that countries are pledging, emissions reductions rather, that countries are pledging. So it's definitely not totally game over, right? We're still absolutely in with a fighting chance of reducing it, global warming by 2100 to less than 2 degrees. And every 1/10 of a degree does matter. So in that lens, you could say, yes, this is very, very bad news because maybe we're going to lose 1/10 of a degree. Maybe we're actually going to be at 2 instead of 1.9, or maybe 2.1 instead of 2. But the actions that the rest of the world are going to take between now and 2100, with or without America, are absolutely still going to improve the future. I don't want to come across as being optimistic at the moment because I'm not feeling optimistic, and I certainly don't want you to come away with this feeling that everything's going to be okay, because this is very, very bad news. But it's not worst case scenario, and there are, if not positives to be found, there are absence of negatives to be stressed. So that's kind of all that I really wanted to say. This is definitely going on the second channel rather than the main channel. I literally just finished painting it over lunch, hence why I'm here. I haven't got the mental RAM to do this properly. But yeah, it's not great, is it? So let's pick up the pieces, carry on moving. And the rest of the world, we've got to carry on doing what we're doing and wait for America to rejoin us if another election happens in 4 years and Americans are ready to rejoin climate efforts on a federal level. States, individuals, keep doing your thing because, we're all in this together and none of us are getting out of this alive. We only have so much time. So, yeah. Maybe this was more therapeutic for me than for you, but I hope that made sense. I'll see you in the next one.